Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones. The unvisited ones. The cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome to the show physicist, light therapist, researcher, and author Anadi Martel. Now, if you've read Pieces of 8, or if you've seen some of the premium member bonus material, you'll know I've long been fascinated by what we stupidly still call alternative medicine, rather than the more clunky, if not more accurate, modes of living and healing that do not emerge from a dysfunctional belief system. And I'm especially interested in the ones that, whilst they can be used for treatment, are better thought of as unavoidable universals. You don't have to use acupuncture, right? But you can't avoid having a relationship with light, and sunlight in particular. So this week's show is a little longer than usual because there is very much to cover. Moving into next year, we'll have probably more episodes like this on the same topic or on similar topics that I am cheekily calling the true universal healthcare. Let's do it. Anadi Martel, welcome aboard.
Thanks, Gordon.
All right, so for first-time guests, Anadi, we have a traditional first question. Were you a weird kid?
How did you guess?
Yeah, it's usually a yes if you get on my show, that's how.
Yes, I can imagine. I probably was, yes. I was attracted from a young age to inner experiences, I'd say. I was perhaps 12 when I fell in love with Bach's cantatas and really had my first taste of beautiful inner joy through the music. Then I got interested later on in physics. I was fascinated by Einstein, by the thought of somebody through the purely the power of the mind could unlock mysteries of realities relating to time and space in the way that he did.
So there's a music of the spheres through line there, isn't there? Because, you know, Einstein famously said he believed in Spinoza's God. So there's some sort of mathematical, musical interest from an early age. Were you from a musical family, or were your parents bewildered when you would take yourself off to your room to listen to Bach?
No, there was music in the family. It wasn't such a surprise.
And was it from that early age? I mean, that sort of defined your career, and we were going to sort of kind of talk about, or at least your higher learning. I mean, from about 12, do you go from Bach to a fascination to Einstein to studying this stuff at a tertiary level? Is that it? Did you kind of know at 12 you were going to be in this, dare I say, music of the spheres land or world?
Oh, pretty much. By the time I was 16, I was at university and studying theoretical physics. And I would have gone on that way, except that around that time I became interested in yet another dimension. I became interested in the Buddha and meditation. And that opened up still another door. And I ended up in India for a few years learning meditation with a wonderful master there. And after that, it was difficult to come back to straight academia life. I felt it too constrictive. So I kind of started a career as an independent consultant and left university after the master's.
Gotcha. So that first interest in the Buddha, was that via a book? Were were there Buddhists on campus? I mean, tell us about that moment when you first kind of were drawn along that path.
A brother of mine started to do Zen meditation, an elder brother, and that somehow really got me intrigued. And that was the starting point. I started to read about these incredible Zen masters who lived centuries ago and their stories. And I realized at some point that it was possible to meet similar people here today. So that's where it got rolling.
So how old were you when you went to India?
I was 18.
Nice. That's a good adventure.
Yes, indeed.
All right. And how long were you there for?
I went on and off for many years, but I spent altogether 3-4 years there.
That's amazing. Whereabouts specifically?
I was with a master called Osho, who was in the area of Mumbai, a small city, medium-sized city called Pune.
Sure.
But I traveled all around. I mean, there's so much to see in India.
Yeah. No, we've had a couple of Osho people on the show before. So you got Osho in India phase rather than US phase?
Yes.
Wonderful.
That was in the 70s.
Oh, cool. Yeah, cool. So that's the perfect combination for, as you say, the kind of work that's associated with your latest book. And given the kind of combination of physics and mathematics and meditation, you're a really good person to ask what I think is a deceptively complicated question, Anadi. What is light?
Wonderful question. Multidimensional. Ultimately, nobody knows. It remains a complete mystery up to this day. And even if sometimes people get the impression that science has figured everything out in our century, but it's far from the case, especially for something as fundamentally mysterious as light. But on a peripheral level, we know a tremendous lot about light and its properties. So it just depends, as with everything else, at what depth or level you're looking at reality.
Well, shall we? Yeah, you go, because I'm very this audience wants to hear the whole thing. Like we as you say, we know we have some good information on a materialist or empirical basis, but that information alone necessarily implies some pretty staggering metaphysical implications. So so let's try, and you're the right person to get what is light, given that it's so foundational to life on the planet, the operation of the universe, and probably worlds beyond, if you will.
Right. Yeah, light is really at the source of all life on our planet. I mean, the basically all energy running the Earth comes from sunlight. And, light is an electromagnetic wave. It's if you look at the way physics sees reality today, we know of 4 fundamental forces in the universe. We can reduce all phenomena to these 4 fundamental forces. And one of them is gravity, which Einstein was very instrumental in understanding, of course, with general relativity. So gravity is one of those fundamental forces. Then the second one is the electromagnetic force. And that's what we know as electricity, as magnetism. And light is actually just another aspect of that same force. Electricity and light are of the same nature. Because the electrical field can start to generate waves, it can oscillate. And these waves propagate through space. And they are what we call the light, when they have a certain range of frequencies. The electromagnetic waves span a tremendous range of frequencies. They go from a few cycles per second all the way through trillions of cycles per second. Actually, there's no real limit And across that whole spectrum of frequencies, the waves take on different properties. When they are at around, for example, a few billion oscillations per second, they are radio waves, the waves that we use in our mobile phones and Wi-Fi and so on. And just multiply the frequency by a factor of a few 10 or 10,000, something like that. And the same wave becomes light. The frequency of the wave is perceived by our sense of vision as light. And then if you still increase the frequency of that same wave, you get into ultraviolet, X-rays, and then gamma rays, extremely intense rays that are present mostly in space, in the galactic phenomena or tremendous astrophysical phenomena where these very high energies are produced in nature. So these waves span this whole tremendous range of frequencies. And there's just one little octave of frequencies that corresponds to light. That little octave actually is not a coincidence because it corresponds precisely to the peak of emission of our sun. If you look at the emission spectrum of the sun, it has a beautiful round shape, the black body curve shape, and the maximum of that spectrum is right in the middle of that one octave of frequencies that we call light. And naturally this happened because life and our sense of vision evolved under the sun spectrum and tuned itself to that kind of maximum emission. So it goes together. We adapted to the properties of the sun.
Well, that's a good next question, right? So there are sort of multiple biological pathways that the human form interacts with light, isn't there? And one of them is visual. But so as we head into discussing light therapy, how else do we as humans interact with light and specifically sunlight? So let's do the benign version, because as you say, we're dealing with the sort of naturally occurring EM spectrum, and there's also an artificial one which requires some discussion later in the show. But so how does the human form interact with light?
Well, you interact with light first at a cellular level. Just when light touches your skin, it triggers all kinds of reactions, photochemical reactions. And some of them are very important. For example, that's how vitamin D is generated through the UV part of the light spectrum. And that's very important for health. And there are other aspects of that cellular interactions which were just discovered more recently, like in the 90s. There was one fundamental discovery by a Russian biophysicist, Tina Karu. She found that the red and near-infrared part of the spectrum have a direct effect on some components of each of our cells and actually accelerate the metabolism of energetic metabolisms of our cells. And that discovery explains some mysteries that have been observed in previous years since the discoveries of laser light, this new wonderful magical light of the laser. Doctors had observed that when you apply that light, it seemed to heal like burns or wounds and so on. So there seemed to be some kind of healing action of that light, but nobody could understand why. And then following Karu's work, it became more clear what was happening. And she was able to analyze exactly the frequency response, the spectrum, which drives that mechanism that is now called Photobiomodulation. And that means simply photo is light, is modulating our biology. It's kind of light can amplify, accelerate the metabolism rate of cells. Basically, it increases production of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is the kind of the fuel unit that our cells work from. So light can help to increase production of ATP and therefore enhance our whole metabolism. And that goes all the way to the DNA of the cells. It's been found since then that this type of light actually helps DNA repair. And so it acts at a very deep level at the cellular level. So that's one aspect of light, interaction of light with us. Very important, definitely. And sometimes we think that light only touches the skin and doesn't go any further in the body. But that's not actually the case. It depends on the frequency, the color of the light. The red color goes quite deep. It actually can go over an inch inside the body. The blue colors don't go so deep. They only go a millimeter or so. But that's still enough to have all kinds of interesting effects on the surface layers of the skin. And if you have infrared light or near-infrared light, it can go quite deep. It can really penetrate down to bones and muscles and so on. So that's why now this kind of light is used in many applications where you can work with bones, joints, and inflammation in muscles and so on. So one very important aspect of working with light for therapy. The other important aspect, as we mentioned earlier, is vision, the visual system. That's a whole different area, a whole kind of different interaction of light with us.
Right. So here's the thing. As I was putting the research together, and before we hit the record button, as you know, I'm kind of, well, as you know now, I'm interested in the negative impacts of artificial EMF, whether it's blue light in a kind of modern industrial environment, whether it's the rise of 5G and all this kind of thing. And I have this question I ask for people who are involved in frontier science, Anadi. And it is, you're at a hypothetical barbecue. So you're out and you're meeting new people and you get asked what it is you do. And the person who asks you that maybe displays some cynicism about, light as therapy. Like, well, that sounds a bit hokey to me. What is the evidence that you, like the empirical evidence that's publicly available that you would bring up in a casual setting to say, well, as a matter of fact, it's more or less demonstrated that light is therapeutic? What is the thing you bring up in a barbecue when someone's like, what is that, like crystals? Is it when you can kind of give some empirical evidence to them, but in a casual setting rather than, hey, read this report?
Well, if that question had been asked just 20 years ago, you would have been justified to consider light effect. Hokey, as you say. Is that an Australian?
Hokey is that's possibly more American. Well, Han Solo says it, so I don't know.
Sorry, I couldn't say I'm French Canadian, so my.
Sure.
But today, that's absolutely not the case because the field of light medicine is actually very well documented and quite vast at this point. There are literally thousands of researchers and medical professionals studying the effects of light as we speak. So it's certainly not anymore at all some kind of strange alternative new age thing. It's very much a scientific reality. And you can look at many different applications that are actually everywhere around us now. For example, I think there's hardly a aesthetics and beauty shop now that doesn't use LEDs to help to enhance skin tone and eliminate acne and there's all kinds of applications of light now on the skin at that level, which are really very commonly seen. And the effects of these things are very real and have been documented and studied and so on. Then you must have heard also of things like the treatment of seasonal affective disorders, SAD.
That would have been my smoking gun. So we've been using light to treat seasonal affective disorder for about almost 40 years now. So come on, that would have been mine.
That's actually so widely known that people usually associate that particular treatment to, they call it light therapy as such. Whereas actually light therapy is a very wide term. It would be the use of light for therapy. And as we'll see in this conversation, there are many, many applications besides the use of bright light for SAD treatment. But in the public's mind, it's kind of, when you talk about light therapy, they immediately think of SAD treatment because it was perhaps the first commonly known use of light for therapy.
Well, the first commonly known at the back end of the 20th century, because what was so interesting about your book, of course, and you kind of touched on it when we spoke about photobiomodulation, is that Russia and the Eastern Bloc for a while were further ahead than us in the West on this, weren't they? And a big part of that is the rise of 20th century modern medicine for good and for ill. For instance, I mean, what's the relationship between light therapies in the West and, say, the rise of penicillin?
Well, if you look back towards the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, light medicine was actually very much in vogue. It was widely used because at that time it was found that it was an excellent treatment for tuberculosis, which had no cure in those days. And so many doctors were experimenting with different forms of light therapy. And in fact, one of the very first Nobel Prizes in medicine was awarded to a doctor for his use of photomedicine. It was Dr. Finson in 1903. So if you look at that time, light therapy was very much respected as a medical discipline. And in the early 20th century, there were many systems that evolved to treat with light and colors. And that changed very drastically around 1930, 1940. And that corresponds, as you mentioned, to the discovery of antibiotics, penicillin. Because from that time, there were suddenly ways of treating which were far more fast and reliable than light, which was a more slow and a subtle way to work. And so once antibiotics became available, these older forms of treatments were kind of left on the side. And
that's actually only half the story, though, isn't it? They were also actively discouraged.
Story because, yes, it went further than that. And that's actually the case with not only with light therapy, but with many forms of what you would call more subtle energy medicines. For example, homeopathy or naturopathy and all kinds of more subtle ways to work were really systematically eradicated by the medical industry.
Once the commercial imperative for selling pills was there, the competition had to be eradicated.
Something like that, yeah. I mean, it's a complex story, but for sure it was not entirely objective and for the good of people uniquely. There was definitely a strong lobbying commercial aspect, and organizations like the FDA and so on were actively enrolled by the pharmaceutical industry to snuff out the competition. And so many of these light therapy pioneers, which were working in the early 20th century, were actively persecuted. Their work was destroyed, some were put in jail, and so on. It's not a very nice story. And so from, I'd say, 1950s light therapy became thoroughly discredited. It wasn't at all anything that any respectable scientist or doctor would want to touch. It was really considered as totally unscientific and so on. So there was kind of a swing of the pendulum in the opposite direction. And it remained that way for pretty much the rest of the 20th century, until two key discoveries, which completely changed the picture. The first one is the one I just mentioned from Professor Karu, because she was able to establish, in most undeniable scientific terms, the exact mechanism through which light enhances cell metabolism. And once that was done, once she published her articles, suddenly it opened the door to many more researchers. It became clear that there was something that was very real and that you could actually study. And so since then, since the mid-1990s, that whole field has exploded and is still very much in discovery mode as we speak. So that was one of the main discoveries that changed the whole landscape. The second one happened in the early 2000s, and that was a discovery related to the sense of vision. And it was the discovery of the what's called now the non-visual optic pathway. Of course, the optic pathway has been very well known and studied for over a century. It's the connection between the eye, the retina, and the light sensors at the back of our eyes, through the optic nerve, going all the way to the back of the brain, to the visual cortex. And a big part of our brain is devoted to analyzing that signal coming from the eyes. It's our whole sense of vision, which is so important. It's said that 80% of our sensory input comes from vision. So that's been widely studied and explored, both the eye, the retina, and the brain centers, the visual centers. But around 2000, it was discovered that there was actually a different pathway within the optic nerve that was completely separate from that visual pathway that had been explored so extensively. And it's different nerve fibers that go from the eye directly to the hypothalamus, the very core of the brain, the central part of the brain. And there, it's light directly impacts our whole hormonal balance through different structures in the hypothalamus. And that was quite a bombshell also in the medical and scientific community, because suddenly it became much more plausible to accept that light could have a very deep impact on our whole inner balance and much more in our body than just what we see. There's a whole part of light that we don't see necessarily, but that has a profound impact on many aspects of our inner systems. And what was found early on is that particular pathway, the non-visual pathway, is key to maintaining our circadian rhythm. That's our inner clock that synchronizes us with the daylight rhythm. And it goes very deep. It was found just recently, a couple of years ago, it became clear through genetic studies that, in fact, over half of all the action of our genes throughout our body have a circadian component, are linked to this daily cycle. So it really has a tremendous impact on all levels of our biology.
Yeah.
Of course, the sleep-wake cycle, but all kinds of things, the hormonal cycles, digestion cycles. Our whole body really is driven by this daily rhythm.
And that, for me, this is where, almost coming back to the barbecue, I'm so interested in light therapy, is it passes the common sense test, which is two things. the overwhelming majority of the energy on Earth comes from the sun, or life on Earth runs on light, more or less, right?
Totally.
And humans, specifically, appear to be built, as far as I can tell, to spend 70% of our time outdoors rather than the less than 3% modern Americans do. And not just that, we spend the overwhelming majority of our time now surrounded by an artificial version of light. And here we have, so we're built to function on light as it is quote unquote naturally occurring, and we remove ourselves from it for the majority of time and also bathe our cells and our brain and our hormonal system and so on in parts of the spectrum that demonstrably either interfere with that or have provably negative effects. So light therapy is one of those, I would say, essential areas that falls into a common sense, holistic understanding of the world.
Very true. Yes. And in fact, because light can have such a powerful effect on our health, can have such a beneficial effect, it also implies that it can have a negative effect if it's wrongly used, as you implied. And
we're off the map here because we've sort of spent 2 million years bathed in the natural, natural EM spectrum, right? And we've spent the last, well, we'll say 150 years, but in particular the last couple of decades, 3 or 4 decades, in a very, very different EMF environment. So we don't actually know how much, although it's probably quite a bit, how much of the sort of chronic conditions that are associated with Western life, because we have, it's like putting a fish in beer. It'll probably live for a while.
Depends which beer, I guess.
True. Yeah. I mean, it's a good way to go, but but it is so different, and we're off the map because we don't know, because we are the test generations in the sense of, well, let's see what happens to mankind, and all of a sudden we have this rise of a lot of interrelated chronic conditions. And this is why what I find so interesting about photobiomodulation and the impact on mitochondrial DNA is if you are disruptive at that level of the human body, it has a cascade effect. You're talking about cancer, you're talking about heart disease, you're talking about immune damage, all the rest of it, and it's right. It's a big deal, isn't it?
Absolutely. And when you talk about EMF fields, of course, you have the whole question of radio fields, which is that could be a whole show in itself. So we won't go into that because we want to talk about light here.
Sure.
But in terms of light, it's interesting to see that. As you mentioned, we've been exposed to artificial light pretty much since the Edison's day, when the incandescent light was discovered, early 20th century, and it's a kind of a coincidence that this first form of artificial light, widely spread artificial light that was used, is actually quite similar in terms of spectrum to natural sunlight. If you look at the spectrum of an incandescent bulb, it's just like a miniature sun. It's a source of heat, intense source of heat at a few thousand degrees. And that's just what the sun is. The sun is a ball of hot gas. It's at about 5,000 degrees Kelvin at the surface. And the light that it emits corresponds to the light from that type of hot emitting body, radiating body. And so a light bulb is just the same. So the spectrum of light bulb is not so different from the natural sunlight spectrum, which means that we've kind of gotten used to the idea that artificial light is fine. It doesn't disturb us so much. We've been living under it for a century without that many bad effects. So that's kind of become part of our unconscious ideas that there's no trouble with artificial light. It's fine. But as you mentioned, in the past few years, we're starting to use different sorts of artificial lights. First, there was fluorescence. For a few years, we had these little fluorocompact light bulbs that were kind of pushed in the industry to for a very noble goal of trying to reduce energy consumption, reduce greenhouse gases, which is of course a very worthwhile goal. But doing it in this way may not have been the most clever way to save money and the environment. Because if you look at fluorescent light, its spectrum is completely different from sunlight or incandescent light. It has very sharp peaks. It has rays that correspond to the resonance frequencies of metals in the gas of the bulb, mostly mercury. And so you can expect that this very different spectrum will have different biological effects than a natural sun spectrum or incandescent spectrum. And indeed, it is the case. And the question is still valid today because the latest generation of artificial light that is gaining now, of course, are LEDs. And basically, it's displacing all other forms of artificial light now. Pretty much everything you find in shops are LED light bulbs. And again, if you look at the spectrum of an LED light bulb, it's quite different than the natural sunlight spectrum. So you would expect different effects on our biology. And that's the case. That's what researchers in the field have been saying for quite a while now. And in a way, the rush to switch over from incandescent to LED light bulbs is, in a way, some kind of gigantic planet-wide photobiological experiment to which the whole population is being subjected. Because nobody really knows what are the full impacts of these different spectrums.
And for me, this is interesting because it comes back to why, say, the Soviets were further ahead. They got to do this research in a different commercial and regulatory environment where we had kicked it away. So we've sort of had this uneven development of the technology to deliver different forms of artificial light, and its potential impact on human health are sort of out of sequence, and we're trying to close that gap as quickly as possible now, and it's pretty alarming, I think, for people who are listening. And what I want to talk about, it's an oversimplification, I understand, but I want to talk about blue light and its impact. So this is the oversimplification. Humans in the West get too much blue light and not enough red light, right? But I mean, blue light is kind of a nice catch-all to talk about the light that has a negative impact. Well, too much blue light having a majority negative impact in a developed sense. So, I mean, what does it look like blue light does, for instance, to your mitochondria?
Blue light doesn't do much to mitochondria.
Okay, good.
Blue light affects your circadian rhythm. This non-visual optic pathway I just mentioned earlier is actually driven by blue light. It's the nerve fibers connected to the hypothalamus are linked to a specific kind of photosensor in the retina that is sensitive specifically to blue light. And the reason for this is that it's adapted to bright daylight. At midday, this is when the natural spectrum, daylight spectrum, has the most blue content. And so our body learned to recognize that peak of blue as midday and to use it as a synchronizing signal for our inner clock. Now, the problem is that these new light sources like fluorescent or most LED light bulbs have an excess of blue light. If you look at the spectrum, they have a peak in the blue, that's right at the frequency that our body uses to get the signal that now it's full midday, it's time to reset your clock. And the problem arises when you have that kind of light at nighttime or in the evening, because that disrupts the whole clock system. The body starts to not be able to synchronize properly. And as you said earlier, this has all kinds of cascade effects, leading to chronic problems all the way to cancers and so on. So this is the trouble with this blue light, that it's interfering with our natural circadian rhythm.
So the screens on your laptop and mobile phone that the majority of people listening to this will be looking at in bed just before sleep, these non-optic pathways are telling your brain and your essentially your hormonal system that it's literally the middle of the day.
Right.
Yeah. So there's an element of light therapy that is in fact dark therapy, right? Which is when it comes to nighttime, don't have these electrical devices anywhere in your bedroom and make sure you are sleeping in as pitch black as you can get it.
Absolutely. This is one aspect of healthy lighting. It's to really restore darkness and during nighttime. Ideally, you should never have more light in your environment than what you'd get from the full moon at night.
Oh, that's a really good way of thinking about it. I love that.
Yeah. And it's ideally you shouldn't look at the blue light source for at least a couple of hours before you would go to sleep. And well, now you have these utilities on phones and computers to reduce blue light at night. Fortunately, this is a good development. On like Apple includes it in the operating system now, and you can install it for PCs with a wonderful app that's called Flux that does the same. And so it's very good to have that on your computers to reduce the proportion of blue at night as the day ends. That's something simple that you can do.
I also have some terribly fashionable blue blocker glasses, and so I'll switch my Kindle to night mode and put them on, and yeah, fortunately no one sees. It's interesting. It's gotten so much more difficult. So because we have a combined solar and normal electric grid setup on the farm, we have quite chunky power adapters to make sure we, to de-risk surges and so on your electrical devices. And so I have these things to run the lamps in the bedroom, and they have blue lights on them that are so unbelievably bright, just to say that there's power running through it, that it can actually illuminate the entire room. So I've noticed in the last decade, the amount of devices that will be emitting a light just because it's plugged in is crazy. And so we've got as few things as we can in the bedroom, but I need, a power board to run the lamp so I can read a book rather than use my screen. And so you end up having to cover up all these things, and it's this sort of ongoing fight for the darkness. And it's something I think it certainly helped, but I think people need to take darkness as seriously as light when it comes to things we can do. Yes, and unfortunately that seems to be gradually spreading to the common knowledge. I mean, we talk much more now about blue light, where like 5 years ago, researchers in the field were trying to make people aware of the question, but not many people responded. But now finally, it's becoming more common knowledge. And we can hope that within a few years, there'll be some kind of improvements in LED technology that will take care of that will reduce this blue, excessive blue in the spectrum. And the other aspect that you also touched on earlier is the red part of the spectrum. And that, unfortunately, that aspect is still not really part of common knowledge. And that's one aspect where some researchers in the light therapy field have to act as pioneers now to make that better understood by the community at large. And it's related to the fact that, as we said earlier, the red part of the spectrum, red and near infrared,
is the part of the spectrum that heals cells, that accelerates mitochondrial metabolism. So it's very important, in fact, for the health of our retina as well. Our photosensors have very complex photochemical reactions happening constantly at the sensor level, and they get depleted by some components, by some frequencies of light, and regenerated by other frequencies, especially by the red and infrared. And so in the normal natural light, you always have a balance between the different parts of the spectrum. You have moderate blue from the sun, and you have plenty of red and infrared. Actually, sunlight has a big part of infrared. That's why it's warm. And so in normal light, our retina gets both. It gets the blue light, and it also gets plenty of infrared light. And the blue photons are the most energetic ones. It's the highest frequencies of the spectrum. So they have more capability to induce photooxidative damage to cells. They can knock off electrons and so on, and actually damage our cells. And the red and infrared reverse that damage because exactly. they heal whatever damage is being done by blue light. So in normal light, sunlight, you have a perfect balance of both. The infrared always compensates the photooxidative effects of blue. But if you look at LED light or fluorescent light, it's been engineered specifically to eliminate all infrared because that's where the energy loss happens. It's in the heat. These light sources were created specifically to eliminate heat emission. So that means in practice they have no infrared. So you end up with a spectrum which has high blue, so photooxidative damage, and no red and near infrared to compensate that damage. So that indicates that it can lead to retinal damage at a much faster rhythm than sunlight or incandescent light, as we mentioned, because these good old incandescent bulbs are burning hot, as we know very well. They're full of infrared, so they did maintain a similar balance to sunlight. And so it's suspected now that this type of unbalanced spectrum can lead to things like age-related macular degeneration, which is becoming kind of an epidemic problem now in our developed societies. It's one of the main causes of blindness, and so it might be related to the switch to these new forms of light sources, which unbalanced spectrum light sources.
Do you think some of those early 20th century light therapies, maybe they got the practice right and the theory almost less so? Because I'm just sort of looking at red light therapy as it's used today. It's used for things like athletes will use it to aid in cell repair, because it seems to, as you say, upregulate the immune system and increase the sort of body's ability to regenerate or to heal. Do you think that's sort of how they were working in the case? Like you can upregulate your immune system and thus fight off the tuberculosis, is an example. Do you think that's kind of maybe how these things worked before? Or was it in tuberculosis, were they actually restoring the cells that in the lungs that were damaged by the infection?
Well, it would seem that in the case of tuberculosis, it was mostly the blue and violet and ultraviolet part of the spectrums that were acting. And that was why the sanatoriums were usually at high altitude in the Swiss Alps.
I did not know that. Yeah, cool.
There were plenty also in South America because you wanted to get maximum UV exposure.
Okay.
So, and I guess this was all very much empirical. There's a very old tradition of heliotherapy, which is therapy with sunlight, that was used by all ancient civilizations in Egypt, in Greece, in Rome. They knew very well that it was very healthy to expose yourselves to sunlight, and they had all kinds of healing systems based on using light and sunlight. So it's always been known that sunlight is a very healing resource. And so what they did in the 19th century, early 20th century is that they studied it more systematically, more scientifically, and understood better the parts of the spectrum which were at work, but they basically refined these age-old techniques of heliotherapy.
See, I'm a bit of an old kingdom nerd, and at the beginning of the book, I learned some stuff about just how detailed the Egyptian understanding of the healing properties of sunlight was at the earliest possible age. It was an entire discipline. They used it for more than one thing. It's incredible, and the metaphysical implications of why this works so well are fascinating to me. So that this sort of emerging science is getting closer and closer to the ancient world's at least performative understanding of light. You always have to play that risk of being overly romantic about the past, but they at least had a performative understanding that humans and the sun have some kind of profound interrelationship, right?
Yes.
Here's a good example in the modern age, right? So my previous job in London, I travel a lot for it, and we had this event in Miami, and I found out that it was on Miami Beach that sunscreen was invented. And so I have a question because I want to move into some of the things we get persistently wrong in the world. And so there's an interesting part in the book, and I'll turn it into a question, Anadi. Does melanoma occur more often in people who work outdoors under the sun or indoors away from the sun?
Right. Yeah. What would you guess, huh?
You would guess it would be outdoors, but it's indoors.
Yeah, you would guess it would be outdoors. Yeah, but it is indoors.
So what does that tell us about what causes melanoma?
Well, it's interesting to see how our relationship to UV light has evolved, because as we saw in the early 20th century, people went at high altitudes in sanatoriums to be exposed to UV for healing. And so it was considered as a healing form of light. And look where we are today, where we are totally paranoid about UV light. We cover ourselves with sunscreens. We have sunglasses. We wear clothes. We're totally afraid of exposing ourselves to UV light. So it's been quite a change from within a century of perception. And it's clear that skin cancer is a major problem, and that it is caused by UV light in part. And that's why the medical community has switched to this extreme reaction of advising to avoid all kinds of UV light. It's kind of a precautionary principle that's it's a one-size-fits-all solution. That it's the easiest form. If you claim that, of course, you take no risk. And that's what the approach of the medical community. But it is, if you start to look in the details, it gets more complex. Because, well, first of all, you need UV light to generate vitamin D. And if you lack vitamin D, you're in big trouble. It's absolutely essential to health. And most studies show that the majority of people in the Western world are lacking in vitamin D. We don't have enough. Because, as you said, as you mentioned, we don't absorb enough sunlight. We live indoors, and we cover ourselves constantly.
And because, crucially, there is no vitamin D supplementation that will actually match getting it from the sun. So you can't be like, I work nights and sleep days, I'll just take the pills. The pills are better than nothing, I guess, but it has to be from the sun, doesn't it?
That's a complex question. I think there's different opinions on that. But there is, I've read many times that the type of vitamin D that's generated by sunlight is healthier than what you'll get through pills. Pills will be slightly different molecules which are better than nothing, as you said, but won't replace the full effects of vitamin D from sunlight. And it works very fast. You only need a few minutes, like a few minutes in bright sunlight over your whole skin, and you have enough vitamin D for days. It's a very efficient mechanism.
So because I've been thinking about this, melanoma is obviously especially growing up in Australia, it's a big deal here. We have lots of sun. It's a desert continent, right? And it was fascinating. I mentioned Jason Borden-Smith earlier, but he kind of talked us through some of the research in May, where the rise in melanoma in the second half of the 20th century in Australia actually precisely matches the amount of time we were spending less in the fields, because it was a much more agrarian economy prior to World War II, and then we industrialize and move into cities, and that's where it grows. And in the last 10 or so, maybe even 15 years, it has stopped growing and to some extent declines. And this is a problem of data interpretation, because what that means is we've reached the point of maximum damage of being out of the sun, rather than we've turned the corner and we're getting better at it. So the hit on the population of a incorrect relationship with sunlight is at maximum. Like we can't get any more damaged by wearing the hats and the sunscreen. Mm-hmm. And part of the dance of a healthy relationship with sunlight, it seems to me, in a country that's as arid and bathed in sunlight as Australia, is, as you say, the timing of it. Don't spend an hour at midday sunbathing, right? But because you only need, particularly in high summer, you'll only need a few minutes of getting that sun, and that is, if you time that right, it's making sure you don't overcook yourself.
It's always a matter of balance, like in everything else. And it's a little surprising for most people to hear that the most efficient way to deal with this is to expose yourself at midday, at maximum sun, rather than later in the evening, afternoon, or early morning. You would think it would be the opposite. But the whole idea is to minimize any damage caused by UV that will burn your skin and lead to skin cancers, while maximizing vitamin D production. And it turns out that the most efficient way to do this is to have a very short time at the maximum sunlight, because that's when you will get maximum vitamin D for minimal skin damage. And of course, the larger the surface you can expose, the more efficient this becomes, because the vitamin D production is proportional to the surface of skin that's exposed. And again, if you expose a large surface of skin for a short time, nowhere do you get enough sun to come anywhere close to burning the skin, which is when it becomes dangerous. Sunburn is indeed very unhealthy. So that's a trick, to expose yourself closer to midday, maximum surface, and short time. You should never come anywhere close to sunburn. So just it can be actually, this has to be gradual. That's another thing to understand. You shouldn't suddenly on the first day go for 10 minutes under bright sun. It'll be much too brutal.
I would catch fire, Anadi, if I did, because we're heading into summer here, and I'm absolutely going to do it, but it's going to be 60 seconds one side, 60 seconds the next, and then I'm going to flee, because I would catch fire.
You don't want that. But it's a fact that it's a gradual process. For example, in the heliotherapy centers in the early 20th century, people would be exposed in a very gradual way. The first days there would be a few minutes in the sun, and every day a few minutes more, and maybe the whole process would take a month before they would end up spending more time. So you have to be very careful and really very attentive to what your body tells you, and never in any way exceed what's healthy. And always be careful for your eyes also. The eyes are very sensitive in bright sunlight, so that's definitely worthwhile to take care when you want to take sun for vitamin D.
For Australians, as I understand it, yeah, it's generally best practice if you're going to do this for a minute or a couple of minutes. If you're new to it, it's to essentially just cover the face anyway. If you can get the rest of you as exposed as possible, just put a hat on your face and set the timer, and then flip 60 seconds later.
Right. So that'll give you a healthy dose of vitamin D, and that has positive impacts on all kinds of health aspects.
So this is a good way of kind of pulling all that together. So what are let's talk about the universals, and then let's talk of what basically everyone should do. And then I want to talk about sort of specific conditions and say, for instance, the use of color and light in treating things like depression. But so we've kind of got a couple of universals that have emerged out of our discussion. Your bedroom should be as close to darkness as possible when you are sleeping. Probably no more light than the light of a full moon. I love that. I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. What are some of the universals that people can, if you're just a normal functioning human without a need for a specific light therapy treatment, how should we be living, if that makes sense? What else can we add to that list?
Well, you can try to surround yourself with artificial lighting that's as healthy as possible. I would say ideally still today the healthiest form of lighting is still the good old halogen or incandescent bulbs, if you can still find them, which is getting more and more difficult. And otherwise, if you use LED light bulbs, at least there are ways to minimize problems. For example, use light bulbs with lower color temperature. Light bulbs of the type that's called like warm white, a little more yellowish color, like 2700 degrees or 3000 K, something like that. And avoid in your environment for evening lighting the high temperature types like 6,000 Ks, which are more bluish in tint. So that's one very simple thing. Select low CCT LED bulbs. And another unknown aspect of LED bulbs is quite separately from the spectral aspect, is that they tend to emit a pulsing light. They flicker at high frequency. And this is something most people are not aware of. Because you don't see it, our visual system will not perceive pulsations faster than what's called the flicker fusion frequency, which is around 50 to 70 hertz for most people. So if you have a pulsing light above that frequency, you don't really see it. But it still has an impact on you. It still can cause visual discomfort, it can cause migraines, it can cause... it's kind of an environmental stress that's around you that you're not aware of, that adds up to all of the stresses. And there's really no need for it, because some LED light bulbs are fine, they don't pulse, and some others pulse very strongly. And that's kind of currently, today it's a problem because there's no easy way to detect which ones do. You need a little detector for that. There are some simple ways just to convert the light signal into sound, so you can immediately see which LED bulbs are pulsing or not. And so it's much better when you select LED bulbs. That's another consideration. Try to find some which are not pulsing, which have low light noise.
Oh, just to interrupt, because I'm thinking I would like people to maybe take some of this information to their human resources department, because it's a workplace health issue as well. Off the top of your head, what research would they go and find on the internet to say, especially if people haven't heard it before, by the way, HR department, I'm not crazy. I think we can do something to improve the health of the employees here by analyzing what we use as light sources, because there are some, not bad options.
Mm-hmm. Well, I give references in the book. There's a number of articles on describing the detrimental effects of light noise. And again, it's gradually filtering to the community at large. It's still, hopefully, these issues will be better understood within a few years. We're kind of in a transition period. But for example, the latest recommendations of the lighting industry do specify that manufacturers should avoid flickering at high flickering below a certain threshold of frequency, below something like 3000 hertz. So, but these are only recommendations, and there are no binding regulations. So manufacturers are in no way obliged to design to these specs that are recommended, and because it's more expensive, very few do. Actually,
we'll have to wait for the inevitable class action suit for that to happen. But I think the fact that it's at the base of so many chronic conditions means maybe we'll see that in our lifetime.
Well, just very quickly, you can get an idea of what when you translate that light noise into sound, what you get. I'll just briefly here, I'll turn on an LED source and put on my sensor. You can hear that buzz?
Yes, that's appalling.
That's not very pleasant, isn't it?
No.
And that's what you get in your whole environment, this pulsing light that you're not aware of, but that's kind of constant pressure. And again, it's very easy to avoid because there are many LED bulbs which don't have that issue.
That's amazing. Well, I'll definitely tell people to get the book. So we've got maximal darkness for sleep. Obviously, don't use screens or try and minimize the blue light impact for several hours before sleep. There's expose yourself strategically to sunlight in the middle of the day if possible. So that's the good kind of like, and as you say, make your artificial EMF environment in toto, not just with light, but everything else, as minimize the damage from that as much as possible. There's a couple of things that I found this stuff really, really interesting about the use of the sensor sphere, which is some of your tech for things like treating depression with color. I mean, how do some of these, how do they treat depression? How do these light therapies treat depression?
Well, now we're getting into a new dimension of light, which is the dimension of color. Using colors as a form of therapy. That's called Chroma Therapy. And again, in the early 20th century, there were all kinds of sophisticated chromotherapy systems. Pioneers like Dinsha Gadiali and Harry Spittler and so on created healing systems using colors. And that all disappeared in the 20th century. It was turned into Quakery and so on. And we're only gradually coming back to exploring colors and color therapy in recent years. And the difficulty here is that when you deal with color, you deal with not only with biochemical aspects of light, as you do when we talked about the impact of blue light on our circadian rhythm or the impact of light on photobiomodulation. These are all biochemical phenomena. But there's a whole other powerful impact of light through the visual system. As we said earlier, vision is 80% of our sensory input, and it translates into awareness, consciousness. So light and colors have an impact on our mind, not only on our body. And that opens up a whole other field of therapy, which works more on healing the mind and bringing back balance to the mind and to when you talk about depression, for example, much of depression is driven by mind issues, mind problems. There's a physical part and there's a mental part to something like depression. So you can attack it from the physical side, or you can attack it from mental side. And on that level, using colors has tremendous potential, because we all feel intuitively that colors act on us in different ways. We have colors that we love, we have colors that we hate, and we We all have a very personal relationship with colors. And so all these issues mean that it's quite difficult to study color in a scientific way, in the same way that you can study the biochemical effects of light. And this explains why today, while the field of light medicine is in full expansion and quite now respected in scientific terms, the field of Chroma Therapy using colors is still somewhat part of alternative medicine. It still has not had its renaissance that the other aspects of light medicine have experienced in the past 20 years.
Would you say, just to interrupt there, Anadi, would you say, because I agree, but that strikes me as a failure of the premise of materialism, because it is more difficult. The relationship is more subjective, but that doesn't mean it's fake. It's only fake if you subscribe to the faulty notion of materialism. So do you think it's an error or shortcoming in how we validate the truth of things in medicine and rather than it almost being more challenging? I find it fascinating to look at it over a 2-century span, right? So the 20th century, we have light medicine, which, as you say, we sort of have the photochemistry of it, of the full spectrum, use of full spectrum of light and kind of getting an understanding of blue does this and red does this and UV does this and whatever. And it just seems like maybe by the end of this century, we will have dropped down to the next level, because if the top one works, if total light works, then there is the opportunity to be more nuanced with it as we sort of hive off into different parts of its sort of component spectrum, isn't it?
Oh, yes, definitely. And for sure, the difficulty here is our materialistic way of looking at things. And that's why studying mental effects and even more subtle effects at the level of consciousness are, of course, much less part of mainstream science. It doesn't mean at all that it's not real and powerful. It just means that it's still not yet well-established science. But that didn't prevent people from using colors for healing for thousands of years. And it's not preventing many new researchers appearing now using all the new possibilities brought by technology to explore colors. Because now we can actually shape and create colors in a much more precise and powerful way than we ever could in the past. So we're seeing now all kinds of new fascinating ways of working with color appearing. And in my work, I deal with many of these researchers. There's a whole community of people around the world exploring the effects of colors. And so I definitely, there are many very effective systems using colors that are in use today. And I myself, I'm working in that field. So obviously I I know what power it can have.
It's so exciting. You're right that the technology we have to effectively shape light or bring to prominence different parts of the spectrum has never been better. And if we can get past it, you just think, if we had a more functional, accepted, I guess, scientific cosmology, like if science isn't attached to materialism is just wrong. Science is a method, right? So you just think, God, if you could just get those two to align, it would be a fascinating century, right? Like for the whole world.
That's where we're heading. I have no doubt that we're evolving in that direction. I mean, the whole field of energy medicine, subtle energy medicine, is evolving. I mean, there are, as I mentioned in the book, I have a chapter on that. You can see that there are many fundamental discoveries that are happening that make it more and more difficult for any scientist who's open-minded to deny the reality of these energy aspects of healing and way of interacting with the body.
The book is fantastic. It's a really patient survey of the history of it and how it works and where it is now. I think if people, because everyone is, as you say, they're all kind of aware of, well, I shouldn't be using screens before sleep and so on. But if you're looking for the book, which is like, where did we come from in terms of light therapy in the modern world and where it's going now? And what I find so fascinating, as I said, is that where it's going now gets closer and closer to the understanding of light that you find in Greece and Egypt and so on. But now we have the technology to really build on some of their premises and see just how right they were.
Right. Yeah, because if you take, for example, traditional systems like acupuncture, which assume that there's a network of meridians, kind of energy circuits within the body, and there's more and more research trying to identify those energy circuits within the body. The research indicates that they might very well be of an electromagnetic nature, so they respond to electromagnetic fields, light, radio fields, and so on. And that's why you have these various electromagnetic healing devices. So you can imagine if there's such a network of energy conducting circuits within the body, when you apply light, for example, on the skin somewhere, of course you have the biochemical aspects on the cells that are illuminated at that point, but that light is transferred through these energetic circuits through the whole body. And so now you don't simply touch one little patch of skin. You can interact with the whole energy field of the body through these through light and other forms of energies. So that's kind of the principle of energy medicine. And of course, the key is to find ways to communicate with that energy system. And that's what all these researchers are exploring now.
Yeah. Well, I adored the book. As I said, it put a lot more rigor and research behind something that I've been personally interested in for a little while now and have been testing the waters of, and I just thought it's a fantastic achievement, and thank you very much, Anadi, for talking about it with us. And for people who want to know more, and I'm quietly confident a lot of people will, where do they go to find out more about yourself? I will have details about the book, Light Therapies, in the show notes, of course, but where else can they find you online and kind of dive deep with this kind of stuff?
Well, there's light-therapies.com, which is the link to the book. My website is sensora.com, SENSORA. And the Sensora, we can touch on that briefly. It's my own research in the field, using light through the visual system. I created a technique that I call light modulation, where I embed within color projections, pure colors, low-frequency rhythms. So the light not only works through colors, it also works through these delicate low-frequency pulsations. And it turns out that we have all kinds of rhythms within our body which respond to these low frequencies. We have many, many biorhythms in low-frequency range. Rhythms like, for example, brain waves from about 1 hertz to 100 hertz. And with light, you can interact with brain waves in a beautiful way for therapeutic applications. You have slower rhythms, like the heartbeat, around 1 beat per second, the breath even slower. And you have even slower rhythms within the body that take 10 seconds or more to unfold. And so working with light, with these very slow pulsations, you can interact through these various biorhythms through resonance. And so I use this phenomenon to create light projections which combine color with interactions with these biorhythms. And that creates a very beautiful and powerful therapeutic setting that we are applying for different purposes, mostly in psychotherapy. You can work with things like, as we mentioned, depression, burnout, PTSD. We find it also as a good action on chronic pain, fibromyalgia. It can be helpful for addictions, can be helpful for insomnia, stress and anxiety, all kinds of things which are related to the links between the mind and the body. Because working with this type of light and colors, you have a direct input into very deep centers in the brain. You can really reach deep parts of the brain and the unconscious, and just open up these areas in a very natural way through natural stimulation of color. You don't have to use a chemical or a drug or something to try to manipulate the neurotransmitters within your brain, because you can do it in a natural way with colors. They do have an effect on neurotransmitters. So this is the whole pathway that I've been exploring. And the Sensora is the outcome of that exploration. It's a light therapy system that combines light with, there's also a sound component, and there's also a kinesthetic component, low frequency vibrations on skin. And so that you can explore at sensora.com.
Yeah, I love that stuff. I think once I dive deeper into the color components, because there are parts in the esoteric tradition that I want to see where they match. What you're talking about there is like a 21st century Marsilio Ficino approach of kind of, but a better one, because there's some empirical evidence behind it, and I love it. I think it's the most fascinating thing. I would love to have you back on at a later date to talk about it from a color perspective. As you know, it's such a big field, and it's quite important, and so just thank you very much for taking the time and coming to talk to us, and all of this information will be in the show notes.
It's my pleasure, Gordon. I don't know, maybe before we closed, you mentioned the sensosphere and how it could act on depression. Did you want?
Let's give people a taste, because the reason I thought about that one is your quite good hypothesis as to how/why it treats depression is broadly similar to how we think psilocybin disrupts it as well. But talk us through the mechanism that's going on there that allows light to treat depression. More specifically color, because light can treat depression actually in many different ways. You can help depression through photobiomodulation, because if you can stimulate neurons directly with light through transcranial light. You can also treat depression through the circadian rhythm, because often depression is caused by an unbalanced inner clock. So with bright light therapy, similarly to what is done with SAD, you can treat depression. But using color is yet a third way of using light to treat depression. And it's the most subtle way. And the sensosphere is an object that I created after the Sensora, because the Sensora is a large installation that's meant for therapists, and I wanted an object that people can have in their own home that's smaller and more affordable. So I created this light globe using the same technology of pure colors, which have these softly pulsing rhythms that interact with different biorhythms. So, for example, if you pulse the light in the alpha range, you will naturally help the person to go into a relaxed state, which is the natural state of alpha waves. If somebody is depressed, they may need a little boost, so you may want to stimulate a bit of beta waves or intermediate ranges between those two and so on. So you can do that with
your light environment in very. It has to be done in a soft way. You don't want to do it in any aggressive way, like it's not at all like a stroboscope would do. You can work with light pulsations in a much more subtle and soft way, which is what I do in these techniques. And well, you can imagine when you look at the rainbow, the pure colors of the rainbow, nearly everybody derives pleasure from that. It's just enjoyable. We all have a built-in capacity to really drink in these colors and enjoy them. Everybody's attracted to pure colors. So these pure colors just brighten up your day. They just bring in a sense of lightness, or they just restart the flow of these neurotransmitters linked to pleasure, the endorphins and the in a natural way. So in depression, where your brain has stopped producing all these pleasure related neurotransmitters, using this natural pathway to encourage their production can help to kind of jumpstart the neurotransmitter pathways within the brain. So that's a bit the principle behind.
And that, I mean, that having, although I've more or less cured it with light and regular exercise and psychedelics, having experienced depression, it is that if you can get the transmitters, it's almost like you can't get there. None of them work, and you just need a few of them to fire to get you back to feeling what not depression is, for it to begin to take off. And that's why it looks very similar to how we think psilocybin in particular works, which is it reroutes electrical signals through different pathways in the brain to what you're used to. So it's almost like rerouting traffic around bad roads, and that kind of gets you into the air. Like you finally got the neurotransmitters to do the thing that is the opposite of depression, and you only need a little bit of that to kind of to lift it back up. And I found that fascinating. I think that's really interesting experientially for me, but really interesting to see that you can do that with color as well.
Right. Yeah, no, that's very much the way we look at it, yeah.
All right. Well, it's I've definitely kept you for too long, and we have quite the time distance here between Eastern Canada and Southern Tasmania. So Anadi, this has been a delightful chat. Congratulations on the book. It's fantastic. And all the information for people listening will absolutely be in the show notes.
Very good.
Once again, Anadi's book is called Light Therapies, A Complete Guide to the Healing Power of Light. Hopefully this discussion has given you enough to think with regarding your own situation and your own relationship to light and darkness, and where there might be opportunities for immediate improvement. As ever, check out the show notes for more information and more rabbit holes to fall down. Let me know what you think at runesoup.com or the RuneSoup Facebook page. Subscribe to the show wherever you damn like. And find me on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.